right. Looks like the technology is working. Again, hello everybody, and thank you all for joining us today. We'll get started in just a minute. So Fred, what's the temperature now? You said it was pretty chilly overnight.
It's about -11 here, so.
So beautiful day.
Actually, the sun is out. It's gorgeous. If you can get outside for a walk, covering your extremities, you're doing well. It's a beautiful day for a walk, that's for sure. And of course,
there you go.
Lots of the locals have snowmobiles, and I've got a lake at the foot of my street here, and there's hundreds of people out social distancing while they're skating and hiking, and even later in the day, on Saturdays, we usually get some parasailers out on the snow as well. So,
well, that's awesome.
People taking advantage of it.
Yeah, definitely.
I guess it's too early for ice boats at Erie, is it?
Yeah, last time I was down along the waterfront, there was some ice along the waterfront itself, but nothing is really forming and staying solid, at least.
Right.
So yeah, it's a little early for that, but still pretty cold out there.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so I guess we'll get ready to get started here. I know that most of our viewers typically come off of social media, so registered on Zoom, I think we actually had 10. So this looks like to be what we had on the Zoom side of things. So thank you all for joining us. We're extremely excited. I'm always excited to be able to talk and hear from other maritime museums around the country, let alone across the border. And that's what we got today. So welcome to the third edition of our winter lecture series. This program is really designed for us to hear from maritime museums from around the community. And today obviously is no different. We have usually what we do, we pick a historic vessel and hear its story and discuss its impact on shaping the human experience. And this is the perfect example of that today. So couple of quick ground rules. This is being streamed concurrently on Facebook. Luckily, you, the attendee, your face and voice will not be streamed. It's just going to be myself and Fred's beautiful faces going live on Facebook and Zoom. So with that, you, the viewer, are not going to be shown or heard from. Questions are absolutely welcomed. In fact, we hope to receive a lot of them. We typically do, but use the chat function if you're on Zoom down at the bottom. On Facebook, just use the comment bar, ask away. We will have a Q&A session following the presentation, but if you maybe don't understand some terminology or whatever, we'll try to get that answered right away. But besides that, sit back, grab a beverage, relax, and enjoy. So with that, my name is Chuck Johnson. I am the museum educator at the Erie Maritime Museum in U.S. Brig Niagara in Erie, Pennsylvania, and I am thrilled to be welcomed by Mr. Fred Addis of the SS Keewatin, and I will let him introduce himself, and we'll get this thing on the road. Fred?
Well, thank you very much, Chuck. It's a great pleasure to be with you here this afternoon to talk about my favorite subject to talk about, which is the steamship Keewatin. Just personally, I'm the curator of the ship, and I report to a committee of volunteers called Friends of Keewatin. And if you can follow along in the visual organizational chart, the Friends of Keewatin are the management and operation end of an official charity called the R.J. and Diane Peterson Keewatin Foundation, which was a foundation that was set up when Keewatin came north back to Canada in 2012. So my capacity at the museum ship is just to monitor all the systems from a curatorial perspective, at least anyway, and be the gatekeeper for some history. So In doing that, some of you may have had the opportunity to check out Keewatin in advance of joining us today. And I want to say that right off the get-go, that sometimes we get caught up with a little bit of hyperbole, and you've probably seen us define the ship as being the last Edwardian passenger steamship in the world today. That's a whole mouthful. This does not, we certainly do recognize the fact that there is another one. We Canadians sometimes don't like to hear this, but everyone down your neck of the woods will know that just about 56 miles south of Saugatuck, Michigan, where the Keewatin was for many years, there's another ship down there called the Milwaukee Clipper. And although the Milwaukee Clipper has been, I would say, substantially altered, especially in terms of its superstructure back in the late 30s, I think it was. So I guess to qualify that, we would say the Keewatin is the last intact, or the last ship that's basically the same as it was when it finished service back in 1965. So just a shout out to those great people there down in Muskegon who operate the Milwaukee Clipper. We certainly are mindful of what it takes to do that, and a shout out to you. In fact, I should say, as much as we'd like to credit the design and construction of the two ships, the sisters, that's Keewatin and Assiniboia, back in 1907, we'd like to credit that to the Association of the Canadian Pacific Railway with Fairfield Shipbuilding and Engineering in Govan, Scotland. In fact, it's my belief that it was those American ships, two of them were off at the time, including the Juniata, which really inspired the Canadian Pacific Railway on the Great Lakes to design ships which are, if you look at the specs, they're same length, the same beam, except the American ships were a little bit heavier by virtue of having an extra steel deck. So I think the credit for the design of Keewatin and Assiniboia can be largely credited to those very successful ships that were working for a subsidiary of the Pennsylvania Railroad. I think it was called the Erie and Western Railroad, later became the Anchor Line. And so that's, in my opinion, where Keewatin and Assiniboia find their largest roots, especially in terms of design. They were almost identical, designed under almost the same specs, including the engine, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So go ahead, next. So here we are. This is the magnitude of the museum that we have to take care of up here in Canada. The Keewatin is 350 and change in length, 43 and a half in beam, and we like to say about 18,000 square feet of curatorial space aboard that ship. Go ahead. Next. Yeah, so there's once again a throw to the Anchor Line steamers. There were only two of them built by the time Keewatin and Assiniboia were built in 1907. I can't remember which way the other one was, Tionesta or Octorara, but those ships of the Pennsylvania Railroad were instrumental in the design of Keewatin and Assiniboia. So next, these ships were built at Fairfields in Scotland. They were sailed across the Atlantic Ocean in September of 1907. And because the ships at 350 plus feet were too long for the St. Lawrence Seaway canals, St. Lawrence canals and the Welland Canal of the day back in 1907, the ships were designed to be cut in half. And so in fact, special plates were put in the ships so that they'd know exactly where to take them in half. And Keewatin carried with it across the Atlantic Ocean 350 extra tons of coal for the voyage, but also a load of sewer iron pipes for the city of Montreal. Came to Montreal, unloaded those pipes and went back to Quebec to Davy Lausanne shipyard. And basically along the dotted line, they took the ship apart and cut it in half. Next. For transit through the St. Lawrence and Welland canals. And there's a picture of the forward section coming through. You can imagine what a wonderful exercise in ship stability that must have been. And these ships, of course, in this condition were towed entirely along the length of Lake Ontario from, shall we say, the Thousand Islands, Clayton, New York, right to the Welland Canal, and then up the canal through those locks and across Lake Erie into Buffalo. Next. So you can see what they did. Actually, they had there were watertight bulkheads, of course, which kept the individual halves afloat, and then they built some wooden bulkheads as well on the upper decks where the cabins were, and that's how they came up through the system. Next. Just at the Lake Erie entrance of the Welland Canal is a place called Port Colburn. And here's Keewatin being towed into the last lock at Port Colburn before it hits Lake Erie, and then across the, just a hard left to Buffalo after that. Next. Now, this may seem an unusual process to build ships. Obviously, there were shipyards on the American side that could accommodate these size of vessels, but they were also busy. It's quite interesting to note that these ships must have been built under some type of consumer demand by virtue of the fact that they were ordered in December of '06. Orders were confirmed, and the ships were in Canada by September. The last one got in September, and they were actually up in the Great Lakes, up in Owen Sound by Christmas. So, but they weren't the first two. It wasn't the first time that Fairfield had done this for Canadian Pacific. Back in 1883, they built 3 identical ships: Alberta, Athabasca, and Algoma. And these ships came through the St. Lawrence canals and Welland Canal in exactly the same way. So they had some experience in doing that. It may sound like a very novel thing to do. And of course, we know as well that during the First World War, some 17 oversized Canadian and American ships went down to the sea for service on the Atlantic and on the ocean. And they were all cut in half to take down through the canal systems as well. So it wasn't an unheard of technology. Next. So Keewatin and Assiniboia, the sister ships, came up to the Great Lakes, and they operated with a fleet of vessels, initially out of, sorry, I'm just trying to get my mouse back here, initially out of Owen Sound, and then after that, a special new terminus was built for the Canadian Pacific Railway at the bottom of Georgian Bay in Ontario, a place called next Port McNicoll. There we go. Next there. All right. Okay. So, so the ships operated basically out of there from 1912 right up until 1965. Initially, they had a black hulled livery, but later on the hulls were painted entirely white. Next. You can see the type of service that was operated. You could get on a train at Union Station in downtown Toronto, come north to Georgian Bay at Port McNicoll, get off the train, and right onto the ship. And there were also, when automobiles became more popular, of course, people could actually take their cars and would get on the ship. Their cars would be loaded aboard as well. They would sail up to Thunder Bay or Port Arthur, Fort William, as it was known back then, take their cars off and continue on their journey across the Prairie provinces or throughout the Midwest of the United States. It was a major transportation terminus. And not only did they carry passengers west, they also carried freight, small amounts of packaged goods from Ontario's heartland, hinterland, manufactured goods. And on the return trip from the Lakehead, they would bring back grain, primarily bagged grain, some 1,400 tons of it per trip. So the ships could carry passengers as well as grain and freight. Next. This is just a typical poster promoting the service. Next. And another one, you can see it's the style of the great Canadian Pacific Railway liners from the ocean service translated to these much smaller steamers on the Great Lakes. Next. There we see Keewatin at Sault Ste. Marie. When she's coming back down, of course, she's always a little bit heavier with cargo than she would be going up. Next. All right, so that's a little different order here. Then let's try the next one, please, Charles. There we go. Yes. So one of the great things about these ships, and you'll, if you're interested in maritime history as well, this was also the golden age of black and white photography. So we've got some amazing photographs of the ships. I should give a shout out to the many collections that we've been able to cull some of these images from. But this particular image, it comes from my favorite industrial photographer of all time, David Plowden. Some of you may know him from he lives in Illinois, just north of Chicago, and he's taken some of the most iconic black and white images of Great Lakes steamships, but also uh, steamships along the Atlantic seaboard as well. David's work is well known and highly published, and he's been extremely helpful in providing us with some of the images that are so iconic. Next. Now, as I said, the ships last operated in 1965. This is a picture of Keewatin going out of Port McNicoll the last time in 1965. Thereafter, the passenger service was discontinued. There were a number of complications with the completion of the Trans-Canada Highway and also the rise of the popularity of the automobile. People seldom wanted to take these kinds of trips anymore. It was just time consuming for people that were on very busy schedules. And so just like in many other parts of the Great Lakes, the heyday for passenger transportation, overnight passenger transportation service was largely waning. Keewatin also had some problems. There was some complaints. She was coal-fired right up until the bitter end. And of course, that did create a lot of smoke and some complications with that as well. Next. Here's a picture of Keewatin's running mates, actually Sistership. That's the difference. We always sometimes use those terms interchangeably, Sistership and running mate. So Sistership in the sense that they were of identical design. A running mate would be a ship that was on the same run, but may not be necessarily the same physically. Assiniboia, late in her career, was converted to oil fire instead of coal fire, and consequently her stack was lowered considerably because they didn't need all the height to stop the ash from falling on the sunbathers on the deck. So she was shortened for that. After she completed service in '65, it was purchased by a group of Philadelphia businessmen, and under her own steam, she went down to Philadelphia. But unfortunately, next, ship caught fire at Camden, New Jersey, and burned to a total loss, and the hull was scrapped. So a sad day for sure. But that's Keewatin's sister ship, Assiniboia. Next. Some of you will know and may even in fact have visited Keewatin. In 1967, it was purchased by an American interest, a man by the name of Roland J. Peterson in Saugatuck, Michigan, who had a marina development, and he bought the Keewatin from from scrap metal buyers who had purchased the ship from the owners, and he subsequently purchased it from the scrap metal company and had it towed to Saugatuck, Michigan, up in the Kalamazoo River, where it sat right up until 2012. Next. There we are. This is Port McNicoll, where the ship was based. It's basically that harbor, that fork. You can see some elevators there as well. I'm not sure if I can. I don't think I can point to it, but at the top left of the back picture there, that's Port McNicoll. And today it's just a sleepy little town, including the summer residents. It's about 2,500 people, but in its day, it was referred to as the Chicago of the North and had all the trappings of a major metropolitan center. But when the Canadian Pacific Railway decided to close their terminus at Port McNicoll for Great Lakes passenger service, and then eventually shut down the elevators and sold those as well, the town was a little bit on its heels until 2012, when a developer named Skyline came to town and decided that it was going to build a major development, including 1,400 residences, a hotel and convention center complex, and they wanted Keewatin as the centerpiece of their attraction. So a group of business people went down to Douglas, Michigan, and concluded a deal with Mr. Peterson, and consequently in June of 2012, next, the SS Keewatin came home to Port McNicoll again after an absence since 1967, where it was welcomed by many and all. Next. And this was just on the day that the ship arrived. It was tremendously popular, lots of media attention as well. And it was a real touchstone for the community to see their ship come back to town. It's not something, as many of you will know, if you're interested in maritime history, this doesn't happen very often. Next. So from 2012, right up until the present day, a group called the Friends of Keewatin have provided the volunteer labor, all the skills, and many of the trades required to keep this museum attraction in ship shape at Port McNicoll, Ontario. In the last year that the ship operated, that is to say, it did not open last year because of COVID, but in the year previous, nearly 14,000 people went through the ship. And it also was a great, over the years, it's also been fundamental in providing some additional revenue for things like film shoots. It was involved in a Canadian-based series called Murdoch Mysteries, which gets a little bit of airtime down south, I know. And also recently a documentary of the Eastland disaster from Chicago, where many of the interior scenes were filmed using Keewatin. So the ship has done very well, but notwithstanding that, and we'll address this a little bit later on, here we are in 2020, and we're facing a real difficult pass in the history of the ship, which I'll touch on a bit later. But let's just take a quick little visual tour aboard next, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about. Of course, there's the wheelhouse. In the initial iteration of the ship as it came out from Scotland, and for years after, they actually did all the ship handling from a monkey bridge on top of the wheelhouse, which in some of the weather on Lake Superior especially, it must have been extremely chilly, but they finally, like most lake ships, moved everything inside, and this is the way the wheelhouse appears today. Next. As with many ships of its day, the interior of Keewatin is spectacular. It's all wood from the main deck up. And I should point out, the reason that the Milwaukee Clipper was transformed was because of the terrible disaster with the Morro Castle in the United States jurisdiction, where all passenger ships were ordered not to have wooden superstructures after that, and consequently the Milwaukee Clipper superstructure was changed to all steel, but Keewatin today still has all of the wooden superstructure that it had from 1907. Next. Here's the dining room. It just harkens back to another time. Anyone that's worked aboard a ship of this style, sometimes we get caught in a bit of nostalgia and tending to perhaps not overvalue, but we sometimes overstate the grandeur of some of these times. But I think what does it for me, and I did have an opportunity to work on a similar ship, but out on the west coast of Canada, not specifically on these ships. It's the level of detail, especially in the woodwork, that really magnifies and amplifies the experience, and I think it's not lost. And it's, when you want to talk wow factor, the interior appointments of this ship are spectacular, to say the least. Next. Typical cabin. We've got lots of volunteers that are helping to decorate the ship and making sure that when people come aboard for their shipboard experience, they have a chance to have a glimpse into what life might have been like back in the day. Next. So great little, you lift up the lid of the desk, and there's a nice little sink right there for your use. So lots of, these cabins are not huge, but boy, they were really prized, and a trip on Keewatin or Assiniboia up to the lakehead was a real life event. Next. There you are. You get another chance to have a look at it of the gallery, the passage along in front of the cabins, and the passengers that sailed regularly on the ships referred to where this space, the stairwell, whatever you want to call it. They call it the swamp because of all the plants and all the watering of the plants. And these ships were not air conditioned, so you can imagine in the heat of mid-July and August, with all of these plants, it was humid, to say the least. But this is where people used to gather after the meals, and there was a piano down in one of the lobbies and the foyers, and they were great gathering spots when you weren't out on deck. Next. This is the main staircase, and it's a real eye grabber, especially for filmmakers. You know, they approach the ship without seeing a lot of detail, but once they walk inside and walk on these floors and take a few steps up the staircase, they're very easily won over. Tremendous craftsmanship. Next. Here's the ballroom where all the entertainments and musical activities would take place. Just the joinery in the floors is spectacular as well. If you have a chance, I'm the kind of guy I like to see how decks are made, especially wooden decks. And this ship, I could walk around and look at all the joints forever, only because they're so incredibly well done and such a tremendous example of carpentry and joinery of the day. Next. So here we go down into the engine room. This is the engine room telegraph. Of course, this is the method by which the master or the captain of the ship would signal his orders to the engineer on duty as to what he wanted to do, ahead or astern, whatever was required, and at what speed as well. And those signals were relayed down by an identical telegraph in the wheelhouse to when the ship was underway. Next. So one of the real, I think, exemplary, it's hard to call it an artifact because it's so absolutely huge, but the Keewatin featured a steam condensing quadruple expansion engine. There weren't a lot of them. I think Patrick Labate counted 9 of them altogether on the Great Lakes in the entire history of these types of vessels. Unlike the ones on the Pennsylvania Railroad steamers, which were all built at Detroit, these ones were built where the ship was built at Fairfields in Govan, Scotland. Steam was provided for this engine by 4 water tube Scotch boilers, and they had coal bunkers which could hold 200 tons of coal. As I said, to come across the ocean, they added an extra 350 tons, and it would supply steam to the engine, the boilers, at 220 pounds per square inch. So a fairly hefty steam plant, that's for sure. The ship at 100 RPMs could go 14 knots, and its top speed was actually 16. Next. There we are. You can see that the 4 cranks for a quadruple engine, the 4 cranks were balanced on what was called a Yarrow Schlick Tweedy system. And it's just a method of attaching all of those cranks from the individual cylinders to the crank shaft. These could generate 3,300 horsepower, which, as I said, drove the ship along at 14 knots. Next. There we are. So one of our volunteers, and she's got her arm in the cylinder head doing a little bit of cleaning. That's obviously the large cylinder. So the size of the engines, the cylinders were 23.5 inches, 34 inches, 48 inches, and the largest cylinder, was 70 inches in diameter. The stroke on those engines down to the crank was 45 inches, so almost 4 feet of stroke on those 4 cylinders. Next. That's a good view of it. Next. This is the actual steering engine. So in order to move the rudder, of course, on a quadrant, according to the directions from the wheelhouse, there was a special steering engine back aft, and it was powered by this engine. A lovely piece of machinery. You'd die to have that in a museum in our booth all by itself, but it's just one small and almost one of the smallest engines aboard the ship, but an absolute beauty. Next. Oh, here we go back inside just to give you an idea of the parlors. Next. Favorite spot up forward. Next. There we go, one of my favorite views. Next. And here's the windlass used to raise and lower the anchor. You can see the chain, which would be pulled up through the hawse and stored in the chain locker below the windlass. A tremendous machine, as you can well imagine. When that machine starts up, the whole ship vibrates, so nobody's getting any sleep. Next. Next. So as I said, the ship today is extremely popular. We get people coming from literally all over the world to see it. Groups, school children, all the kind of regular business that museums promote. But just by virtue of its pedigree, the Keewatin attracts a very special audience. There is a really fundamental aspect to people visiting the ship that we try not to interfere with, and that is every once in a while you'll see someone on a tour of the ship that's just maybe lagging behind or just soaking things in, and invariably they have a story to tell about an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent that took a voyage on the ship. And I always tell anyone working in the museum field that we're supposed to be very good at talking, but you should be even better at listening, because this kind of a ship or these kinds of museum artifacts have an ability to attract people and attract their stories. And that's how we learn about the life and times of these ships, of these artifacts, and of the people that were involved with them. So it's an exceptional opportunity in bringing out all of those wonderful stories. Next. Oh, these are just a couple more of pictures. I mentioned David Plowden. We'll just skip through these very quickly. Next. The tool rack. Look at that, tremendous diameter. Next. So that's what she looked like when she was underway. This is a little bit later in the fall, so you don't have deck chairs and you don't have passengers lounging or out on beach towels. But it was a very popular spot on the ship when the wind was in the right direction, as you can imagine. Next. And here's the chief engineer of Keewatin. Back in the day, it's just, I believe his name is Mr. Yon, Y-O-N. And I just think it just says so much about steamboating and the characters that operated these vessels in the 40s and the 50s. Next. Oh, we'll go past that one and come back if we have time. Next, please. There we go. So, what's ahead? Some of you may know the contemporary story or what's going on with Keewatin. The long and short of it is this. Back in 2011, when the Canadian developer called Skyline Investments made the deal with R.J. Peterson to bring the ship, they purchased the ship and they were to bring it to Port McNicoll. Part of the agreement of purchase and sale was that the ship would be donated to a charity in Mr. Peterson and his wife's name, the RJ and Diane Peterson. So that charity was established by the developer. But from 2008 to 2012, for whatever reason, the developer never saw fit to conclude that aspect of the purchase and sale agreement and actually hand the ship over to the charity that was established to operate and manage the ship. So we have ourselves in a position now where that very same developer, after having failed to complete their development plans at Port McNicoll now since 2012, now is no longer interested in the property and really no longer interested in operating the ship as such, and has threatened in the last 6 months to take the ship from the community and to move it to Kingston, Ontario, where there is another museum, and it has declared its intentions publicly, and we find ourselves in a very difficult position. We haven't physically been aboard the ship other than for maintenance work crews since last May, mostly because of COVID. They just didn't want any public going aboard. But now we find ourselves completely locked out of the ship. And this is a situation where we have almost 200 volunteers who have put in hundreds, thousands of hours of their time to bring the ship up to just a pristine standard of excellence as a museum attraction. It's a real eye popper. And we find ourselves now that the owner of the ship, the company that has title to it, wants to take it away from us and move it to another community. So suffice it to say, at this moment in time, we're in a pitched battle to try to keep our ship in Port McNicoll. We'll go, let's try the next slide. I can't remember which one it is. Next, please. We've been doing all kinds of fundraising efforts, which have been conditional with some, or coincidental rather, with some promotions that are going on. The Royal Canadian Mint, for example, issued a $30 silver piece with the ship on both sides of it, and the Queen, of course, which we're very proud of and take some funding from. Next. There's also a substantial book with all kinds of original artifacts and duplicate materials in it as well. It's a tremendous asset, and we're selling that to raise funds as well. But what we're doing more than anything else is we've launched a campaign. A private individual from the town began this whole process, a gentleman by the name of Dan Travers, who is trying to keep Keewatin home in Port McNicoll. So this is what we spend our time doing now, trying to do everything we can to raise public awareness and to lobby politically to keep the ship in Port McNicoll, where it operated from 1912 right up until 1965. It's a pitch battle. We are trying to anticipate every move, the next move of the developer owner, at the same time trying to not negotiate, but rather we're trying to communicate with the museum in Kingston to try to understand what their motivation is in this process as well. So I find myself in a situation where I'm a curator of a ship that I haven't been aboard in more than twice in the last 4 months, and consequently trying to honor the legacy of hundreds of volunteers who have put their sweat equity into the ship and now see it threatened by what I believe is just an arbitrary move by a developer. I think at this point, I've lost my clock here, but there we go. I think at this point, if we could perhaps throw it open to some questions, that might be the best way to go. So go to the next one, if you would. I just want to see what it is. Yeah, okay, and one more. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you very much, everyone. I appreciate your interest in Keewatin. There's more stories to be written, but I think the gist of this story today is that all the volunteers that have worked so hard are finding their efforts compromised by a developer that is totally insensitive to the time and energy that they spent on the vessel. And it all speaks to something that we can address perhaps a little bit later, but it's about museums and governance and who owns what and who has charge of what, and when is it appropriate for public agencies to step in, and what is the role of a board of directors? All of those good questions, which museum professionals struggle with all the time. And the good ones keep it all together. And the ones that perhaps are not as skilled, or the ones who perhaps just don't have as much experience, find themselves in difficult situations when we're trying to care for artifacts that are larger than life, shall we say. So let's throw it open to questions from there, and I'll see if I can help.
Yeah, like I said, feel free to use that Q&A feature. Thank you, Fred, for what I think was a great presentation. I absolutely love touring ships like Keewatin. Is absolutely incredible. And like you brought it up, the craftsmanship. I cannot get over some of the photos that you shared today. So, I mean, for you, and while we wait for questions, do you have a favorite part of the ship? For me, like I've worked on battleships and everything like that. I love the engineering spaces, but is there a spot that you like to go to when you're aboard Keewatin?
This might give you a clue. When the John W. Brown, the one of what is it, 3 existing Liberty ships left that were built in the United States. John W. Brown came up into the Great Lakes, I want to say, what was it, 99, to do some riveting at Toledo Shipyard. And they needed some help. So I offered to serve as Canadian agent for the ship. And I had a chance to subsequently go on some living history cruises. And where I volunteer is in the galley. That's
yes.
So that's what I did. I was a galley attendant. What does that mean? I washed dishes and went and fetched stuff for the chefs when I was a teenager on the west coast of Canada, going up to Alaska on cruise ships, not dissimilar, but not as old, of course. And so I have a special spot for the food service aspect of it. I hadn't been aboard Keewatin for quite a few years. And when I went back aboard last fall, boy, oh boy, it just sure tugs at the heartstrings, because I think more than anything, if you could bottle it, you could probably make some money. It was the smell of the place. I don't know what it is, right. Whether it's it's like going into your mother's old apartment building and smelling someone's cooking hamburger and onions, in the hallway, and you think it's just there are mental cues associated with that with the sense of smell. But I have to say the food service area, especially the galley, is a favorite spot for me. But the engine room spaces are spectacular, to say the least. And there are crew quarters that in spaces that the public is not yet allowed to visit. And that's pretty interesting too, when you go down into the crew flats and just see how these guys got along. Yeah, pretty cool.
Yeah, I know what you mean by the smell, though. I have books that I had when I was working aboard USS Massachusetts that I can open up, and I haven't been there in 2 or 3 years, and it smells like my office aboard USS Massachusetts. So, absolutely, you make it like a cologne or something. I'd love it. But we have a question for you. Are there any plans on taking her out on day sails or anything like that? Would you do stuff like that?
I can't imagine any scenario under present regulations where the ship would be certified to carry passengers while underway. Now, I say that, but we all know John W. Brown does it. She, once or twice a year goes out for day sails, and those are absolutely spectacular. I would love to see that happen, but we have in the engine what we call a jacking engine, which allows us to turn the engine over if you want to work on a part that might not be conveniently exposed by the rotation of the shaft. And so we have an ability to make the engine move. So in other words, it's not seized or it's not bound. It wouldn't be practical under its present configuration to operate under steam, because when it was in the United States under Mr. Peterson's care, 2.5 of the 4 boilers were removed. for whatever reason, just to lighten the ship. It was in the Kalamazoo River, so I think draft might have been a problem, but they just took them out. They took two out, and then they cut one in half just so that people could see the water tubes. And it's an interesting educational interpretation artifact for sure, but it certainly would preclude the ship operating under steam power.
Oh, thank you so much. We also have a question from Terry Wyrick, one of our volunteers. How many passengers did Keewatin carry?
288 passengers and a crew of 83. So, you know, by virtue of, you know, the standard of larger passenger ships, ocean-going passenger ships, it's minuscule. But it was a fundamental link, you know, especially before the Trans-Canada Highway was built, and getting people west or getting people back east kind of thing. These ships were spectacular for that. And while the appointments may not appear to be you know, very elegant from perhaps today's standards, they were state of the art back then. So 288 passengers, 83 crew. It did operate much more heavily in the freight area of the business in the shoulder seasons, in the early spring and late fall, before passengers came aboard in large numbers. But they would sail with sometimes 20, 15 passengers and a load of freight kind of thing. So they kept a regular circuit, and it's remarkable for that.
Thank you so much. We have a comment here from another one of our volunteers, Eric Roberts, who says, friends had a boat at Tower Marine. He was friends with Raleigh Peterson. So as a kid, we had many opportunities to go aboard Keewatin. Wow. And so good to know that you're taking care of hers. Yeah, he had mentioned that a couple days ago, but it's a great story, great connection. So, yeah, exactly. So we do have another question. Carol is asking, the photo with the volunteer with her arm in the, oh my goodness, the
cylinder head.
Oh, cylinder. Yes. What were the sizes of those? Do you?
Yeah,
I
do.
remember if you mentioned that.
So quadruple expansion. So 4 cylinders. Here we go. 23.5, 34, 48, and the largest one was 70 inches in diameter. So these are behemoths for sure, with a 45-inch stroke. So very cool.
That's incredible to me. Yeah. That's just amazing. Absolutely amazing. Does anybody else have any other questions? This is a great experience, and I, you know, speaking on behalf of everyone at the Maritime Museum and the Brig Niagara, thank you for coming and talking today. It's certainly different than the, you know, wooden sailing ships of the day. So it's nice to see, you know, different experiences and all that. So we do have a question from Sarah Goodman. It might have been said, but how much coal did the Keewatin carry?
She carried just over 200 tons. So, and you can imagine, you know, there's it was the filthiest job. Just think of the rotation. So the ship comes off, it comes off one of the trips, it ties up in Port McNicoll. You have to get the passengers off, get the passengers' vehicles off in some cases, and then you had to move the ship up the dock to coal it for the next trip, and then you had to move the ship back to where the railway train stopped, and have the ship entirely cleaned out, and of course having dealt with the freight before then as well. So sometimes you'd go across to the elevator and dump all the grain. So it's like 4 jobs just to get it turned around to go back out again in a matter of hours. So these things worked like clockwork and seldom missed a trip. But yeah, 200 tons of coal in the bunkers.
And she continued, what was her longest journey, and how far do we know that she could have traveled on that 200 tons?
Well,
do we know?
Well, they did coal up at both ends. So they'd coal at Fort William. I think the idea was always to have a full bunker of coal just in the event of any emergency. What we do know is that 200 tons of coal wasn't going to get you across the Atlantic Ocean in 1907, which is why they put 350 tons of coal in the cargo hold. So you can imagine that job with sacks of coal, having to go and, you know, pick up the bags and get them back to the boiler room to be able to fire the boiler. So just an interesting aspect of her career.
Definitely. And Carol, going back to the cylinders, why were they different sizes?
Well, that's just the method of steam propulsion. Triple expansion engines were highly favored. Um, these quadruple expansion engines seem to be an aberration. I mean, there were so many triple X's that, and you can see that they endured a lot longer than the quads. But it basically, as you expel the steam from one cylinder, you're not wasting the energy from that. You're pushing it into another cylinder successively. And after you do that 4 times, it was thought to be much more economical in terms of using that 220 pounds per square inch of steam that was being fed into the engine. You could use that steam 4 times to generate 3,300 horsepower, but that's what they were doing. So, you know, every time the steam is expelled from one cylinder, it goes into the next one and is reused and reused. So you're getting 4 times it, but it didn't translate to 4 times the power. And they weren't altogether that much popular after that period of time. So after, I would say, after about the start of the First World War, after that, you didn't see a lot of Quad X being incorporated into ships, new ships.
Yeah, because I don't think I've ever visited a museum ship that I've seen a quadruple expansion engine before. I mean, that's just, it's mind-boggling. But we have a question from Bill Mazeroff. What would it cost approximately to build this ship at today's costs?
Oh, wow, that's interesting. I did see a number once about the total cost of, and it wasn't astronomical. I think the number is something like $180,000 for both ships delivered to Georgian Bay. So the whole process of cutting them in half and putting them back together was all included in that cost. So I would say, obviously you're going to have different sets of regulations and that sort of thing, but I can't imagine being able to build anything like this for under somewhere in the neighborhood of $30 to $40 million. That would be my estimate of it. An expensive process. And once again, you'd have to find ways of incorporating materials either that were fire retardant or absolute metal or steel, because you just wouldn't be allowed to build with the kind of wood superstructures that these ships had.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And then Lori's asking, what was her role in support during the 2 world wars?
Well, basically, it was involved in, she didn't move a lot of ammunition as such, but across Canada, for example, they built military bases right across the whole country, and airfields in places that you would never imagine there would be airfields. It's just what happened. It's kind of like aircraft carriers in the Great Lakes. You did what you had to do at the time, and there were unusual circumstances. So it was supplying military bases and general manufacturing goods in demand during both wars. And it was a tremendous effort to the extent that I know stories of local people who, as volunteers, would come down to the ships when they arrived after a trip and help to get supplies off and supplies on, just so they could keep their schedule and go out. So it wasn't involved in any great movement of troops, because of course we had transcontinental trains by that time. And in the Second World War, we had some aircraft as well. But the ships, in terms of moving supplies and merchandise, were absolutely fundamental in that effort.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any other questions coming through.
Okay.
Is there, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, I've had a chance to, I haven't been in Erie for a while, but back in my sail training days and tall ship days, I spent a fair bit of time there. In fact, I always tell my kids a story that there was a replica of the Santa Maria back in the 1990s that was visiting from, I think she was up from Florida somewhere, and they came up the Welland Canal. Everybody was dog tired because it's an arduous trip up the canal with a sailing ship of that size, and they were just asking, does anybody want to take a trip to Erie, Pennsylvania? So I put my hand up and volunteered, and they asked me what I could do, and I said, well, I can hand reef and steer and know how to do that. So anyway, so they asked me to take a trick at the wheel, And it was about 10:30 at night, and I looked around and there was nobody. It was just me steering the replica of the Mayflower out in the middle of Lake Erie under a star-studded night with a course for Erie, Pennsylvania. And I just think, and there was a point after about 2 hours that I thought, is anybody going to come back here? But somebody showed up at the change of the watch, and I was much relieved because, to me, the shore is looming ever closer. But I had a chance to take the Santa Maria replica into Erie, Pennsylvania, but got a real soft spot for Erie. And I think I was telling Chuck before that I'm a real admirer of Walter Ribka and all the work that he's done there. He's a real professional. We've had this discussion before that, there are a lot of people in the sail training community that get involved because they want to sail. And Walter was a person that always made sure that any matters of governance were taken care of. And I think the tremendous asset that you have there at the Maritime Museum in Erie is a result of his attention to detail. So well done, you guys, because I know that you stand on his shoulders. But it's a great story. Although I have to say, I never understood the don't give up the ship thing, because didn't they actually give up the ship?
Yes.
Let's not go there. Let's not go there. Nope, that's right. That's right. Besides, that was another 2 ships. That was not. That was somebody else's flag. There we go. Great fun.
Yes.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you, and congratulations on all the hard work and the good work that you do there. I know people appreciate it.
Well, I thank you for coming on. Your story right now is at the forefront of my mind. Obviously, I have a soft spot for museum ships for obvious reasons. So, I'm thinking of you guys, and if there's anything I can do to help out, you let me know. And is there anything else you want to say that, is there something coming up on your radar that you want to share with people?
Well, I would ask you to check in at our website, sskeewatin.com. There's lots of things going on. There's petitions you can sign, all of that good stuff. There's merchandise you can buy. We'll take your US dollars any day of the week. But no, we just appreciate the support of fellow museum people who understand, when volunteers have contributed thousands of hours and then we're up against the wall. I've always believed that some good must accrue to all of those people that spent all of those hours bringing that ship up to that standard. So we're hopeful of a positive outcome, but we're in the trenches right now, and we really appreciate your support, and thank you for all the work that you do and this opportunity here today.
Awesome. Well, I thank you for joining, and like Sarah says, God bless volunteers.
That's right.
We have a great group. So do you. And like I said, we look forward to working with you in the future. And thank you all for attending today, and stay warm up there.
Now that's a task. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.